911. Flight to life helicopter just crashed.
Some problems lack solutions.
She survived the crash.
This is not one of those problems.
There are days that I don't want to be stared at.
Fire department now in an ambulance.
And yet, for some reason, the problem persists.
I think it's deplorable.
5 months ago, 9 Wants to Know started asking questions.
The military figured this out in the 70s. What's it going to take?
5 months later, members of Congress have some questions of their own.
I don't know what's taking so long.
Now this, a piece of video some consider a smoking gun
Flight to life helicopter just crashed.
that takes the form
Flames fully engulfed.
of yet another burning helicopter.
It crashed just north of the landing pad.
We've found thousands of others remain at risk.
It's going to happen again and again. No one's standing up yet.
Our investigation has already led to change.
This is terrific. The story needs to be told.
This video may very well lead to more.
I whispered in his ear that Dad loved him and to keep fighting.
The solutions are here.
Simple stuff.
Solutions to the problem surrounding one question: what's fueling the fire? July 3rd, Frisco, Colorado. Exclusively obtained video shows every second of a horrific helicopter crash. It is so graphic, lawyers sent 9 Wants to Know a cease and desist letter demanding we not show you any of it. In the end, we've decided to show you parts of it, simply because it demonstrates just how quickly a survivable helicopter crash can turn into a fireball.
911, what's the address of the emergency?
Winter's snows replaced summer's warmth long ago.
Flight the helicopter just crashed.
Yet,
That we're sending help.
the memories in this Summit County, Colorado Valley
Helicopter just went down.
linger.
It crashed just north of the landing pad. Summit ambulance one en route.
Linger long after the last piece of wreckage left this lot.
The helicopter crashed.
On a warm July day, Don Sather grabbed his cell phone to record what he saw. To him, the fire simply didn't make sense.
My impression would have been that the impact itself would have been survivable with injury.
He would tell the NTSB in this statement he saw the helicopter drop from a height of 30 feet.
Immediate smoke, and then I saw flame.
What he didn't see, what he couldn't see at the time, was what a parking lot surveillance camera captured as well. A fire so intense, it would even catch firefighters
We have flames fully engulfed.
by surprise.
Flames fully engulfed.
So let's go back in time, if only for a few minutes, to show you what happened. 3 cameras record as a Flight for Life crew prepares for a 36-mile goodwill trip to visit Boy Scouts. Early on, it's obvious something is wrong. The Airbus AS-350 spins counterclockwise. Federal investigators still can't say why that happened. Regardless, 32 seconds after takeoff, it crashes in the upper left-hand part of your screen. Here's another angle. The helicopter dips into frame, hitting the parking lot and an RV. 5 seconds after impact, a fire starts. We'll pan away from the cabin and focus on the fuel pouring out. When full, the fuel tank holds 143 gallons of fuel, enough to fill 3 standard bathtubs. The fire has everything it needs.
It's an inferno, absolutely, yeah.
Jimmy Rhodes is a CT tech at the hospital. You can see him here.
I could smell the jet fuel.
The Airbus AS-350, like many helicopters, has a fuel tank found underneath the transmission and very close to the cabin. This model's fuel system relies mostly on standards in place when the Federal Aviation Administration certified it in 1977.
911, are you reporting the Flight for Life helicopter down? Is that what that is, a crash?
Yet this helicopter is only about a year old. Inside, pilot Pat Mahany and flight nurses Dave Repsher and Matt Bowe. 28 seconds after impact, Repsher kicks a door out. Fuel covers his flight suit. He jumps out on fire and starts rolling on the ground. He will suffer burns on more than 90% of his body.
Engine 2, Ambulance 8, respond to the helicopter at Summit Medical Center. We have the Flight for Life helicopter down, fully engulfed.
People nearby start running toward the plume. A minute in, a cyclist enters into frame. Flight nurse Matt Bowe is out. Somehow his flight suit has little fuel on it. He's injured, but still able to walk away.
Ended up being about 50 feet away from me when it crashed.
Jordan Dobrin is on a nearby bicycle path when he sees it. Sees what happens next when CT Tech Jimmy Rhodes grabs a fire extinguisher in an effort to get the pilot out.
We were actually waiting for another explosion, expecting it to just explode again.
At this point, pilot Pat Mahany rolls out. One arm is on fire, but little else. He will die at the hospital, his wife by his side. An autopsy report will say the fire contributed to his death. Fast forward to 2 minutes after impact. At this point, everyone is out. The fire continues burning. Without the fuel system breach, it wouldn't exist. Hours later, our own helicopter, also an AS-350, will show what's left. A skeleton, mostly, of an aircraft used to save lives. Look closely, because it's hardly an isolated event. We've found more than a few skeletons in this country's proverbial closet. So many, we made this map to show you just how often it has happened since 1994 in fatal crashes. Our count shows at least 173 fires.
I had one client that lived in the hospital for 18 months after being burned in a post-crash fire, where but for the fuel tank, he would have walked away.
Attorney Ladd Sanger has battled helicopter manufacturers for years over the issue of antiquated fuel systems. He says the FAA has known about the problem for decades.
Why on earth is that okay?
Because that's the way our system is set up by the FAA.
Copy a downed helicopter.
A system
I have a visual. I'll be en route.
that accepts the fact
We need help.
that on occasion someone is going to burn in full view of someone like Don Sather.
It's tough. I don't know. I hope there are conclusions that lead to safety and other responses.
Sather says he saw the helicopter drop from a height of 3 stories or 30 feet. That's critically important because the latest standards, now 2 decades old, require many helicopter fuel systems survive a drop test of 50 feet. It's why we headed to Arizona to get a better idea of what that drop test is all about.
And it should drop about where it's at.
For all of the complexities of the modern world,
Good on audio, video.
sometimes simplicity
I hope it drops right here.
offers the best option.
Okay, we're all clear.
Simplicity.
Okay, here we go.
Raise it with a crane
We're live, guys. Here we go.
and then
Drop on 3, 2, 1.
see what happens. This is how this country tests helicopter fuel systems. In this case, Robertson Fuel Systems wants to know more about this Kevlar bladder. If it leaks one drop, it fails. It's a test that started decades ago. Back then, the military, tired of losing soldiers to fiery helicopter crashes in Vietnam, started dropping helicopters in an effort to better understand crashworthiness.
Significant amount of fuel leakage on this one.
Jeff Bracken's hard drive likely contains more videos of crashes than anyone's. He knows this testing, his company's testing, eventually changed military aviation.
How often does the military have a crash where there's a post-crash fire in a helicopter these days?
Very rare. Almost non-existent.
Take, for example, the crash of a Black Hawk southwest of Denver in September. The crash injured 2 soldiers, but look closely. You won't see a hint of a fire anywhere. In fact, researchers say, in 4 decades, no more than 1 soldier has died in a post-crash fire.
I found one thermal fatality.
Retired Army Colonel Dennis Shanahan has studied crashworthiness of helicopter fuel systems since the 70s.
When I went into this research in the Army was 1976. And we already had crash-resistant fuel systems in every helicopter in the Army.
It was then, nearly 40 years ago, when researchers concluded the next logical step would be to bring the system to the civilian aviation industry, noting no new scientific breakthroughs would be necessary to do it. In 1980, the National Transportation Safety Board recommended it and repeated the call in 1985. 9 years later, the Federal Aviation Administration finally said okay, but there was a loophole, a big one.
It's kind of a dirty little secret that most of us who've worked in the field know.
Citing a need to be economically fair, at a time when it put a $1.5 million price tag on a human life, the FAA required crashworthy systems only on all newly certified helicopters, not on all newly built. The distinction is a critical one.
I think it's deplorable.
In this story, date of certification means everything. The FAA changed the rules for helicopter fuel tanks back in 1994, but when it did so, it made it mandatory only for newly certified helicopters. So take, for example, the A-Star, or AS-350, that crashed in Frisco earlier this year. The aircraft itself is pretty new, only about a year old, but the model was first certified by the FAA in 1977. Thus, its fuel system needed only to meet standards that are now 38 years old.
We're live, guys. Here we go.
And because most helicopters in use today, from the AS-350 to the Bell 206 and R-44, were certified prior to 1994.
Look good?
There is no requirement they pass this kind of a drop test. In fact, the NTSB estimates the number is enormous. Of the helicopters built since 1994, 85%, or more than 4,700, do not have crash-resistant fuel systems. Systems with such simple things as bladders and breakaway valves. Systems, Robertson says, would cost 1 to 2% of the total cost of the helicopter.
Do you think most people who fly in helicopters are unaware?
In a civilian world? No, I don't think they're aware.
Coming up, a Colorado man with more than 100 reasons to say.
But there are days that I don't want to be stared at.
To say something must change.
It wouldn't make sense. The technology saves lives.
No need for a photo to be worth 1,000 words when so many find their value in far fewer, like this one or this.
Pretty much totally burnt up.
Burned up. Trygve Savard needs no more than a few words to describe his ordeal.
Very, very lucky.
3 years ago in Minnesota, that helicopter nearly burned him alive.
And there was a huge fireball, 18 gallons. I'm still sitting in the middle of it.
The NTSB's accident report says his Robinson 22 erupted shortly after it rotated uncontrollably on the ground near his son's Minnesota home.
Very fortunate that I am alive, especially when you look at what was left.
Very fortunate.
Can everybody hear me all right?
Considering the fortunes.
Who here thinks I look different?
The fortunes of others.
I've had over 100 surgeries.
Jeff Carter knows every time he speaks, he literally forces the audience.
Does anybody know why it's called plastic surgery?
To come face to face with the problem.
This part of my face came from my back. They took that skin off my back and they put it on my face.
1994, the year the FAA changed the rules for some helicopters. His helicopter, a Bell 206, crashed near Tucson, Arizona.
And all of a sudden I think, oh no. And it hit the mountainside and exploded. And that explosion was huge.
Coated with fuel, his face burned.
I couldn't imagine how somebody really could even look at me. Because when I saw myself in the mirror, I didn't recognize myself, and it was difficult to get used to.
The pain was far worse.
It was excruciating. And I have said before that there were a few times I just didn't want to be alive anymore.
20 years later, he knows thousands of helicopters remain vulnerable to the same problem.
I think it's a shame. It's because it's something that could be addressed and could be fixed.
Could be fixed.
Fire department now in an ambulance.
Yet the fires continue.
I got a phone call from my mom at 4 a.m. She said, your sister's been in a wreck.
Lauren Searle's sister Leslie died 4 days after surviving a helicopter crash in Wichita Falls, Texas.
She got herself out of the helicopter. She was 6 feet away when it exploded.
I see the fire on 9th Street.
As a flight nurse on an air evac Bell 206, Leslie was helping treat a gunshot patient when it went down. The fire started shortly after the crash. The inferno, recorded by a local NBC photographer, burned more than 70% of her skin.
I miss her so bad. We had so many plans. She was going to be in my wedding, just like I was in hers. She wanted to move, she wanted to live in Denver. She loved this city. She came and visited me every chance she got.
We also want to have a path that'll kind of wind up there.
A year from now, Lauren Searle and Steve Sweeney,
none of this area here can be developed,
hope to bring the International Air Medical Memorial to this spot just southwest of Denver. Leslie Stewart's name will be one of many on a wall here.
If she had survived, she would be right here with me saying, not again. And that's why.
Our data shows Leslie Stewart is one of at least 78 people who survived a crash only to burn and die in the fire that ensued.
I've seen more than anything the aftermath. And a lot of these accidents, what sticks out is, in many cases, the aircraft is just consumed. And you have to wonder why.
Why? And why does it keep happening in places like Corona, California, Paducah, Texas, Sebring, Florida, Georgetown, South Carolina, Atlanta, Georgia, and Frisco, Colorado, providing even more pictures that say far more than 1,000 words ever could.
It's going to happen again and again, and no one's standing up yet.
So, who can change things? Who can make a difference?
Do you believe the FAA acts too slowly?
9 Wants to Know looks for answers from those in charge.
I always thank you for helping us get the word out, and you guys are helping us do that.
Several times a week, this Airlife Bell 407 takes off from Skyridge Medical Center. It carries a crew of 3 and a crash-resistant fuel system. A system that includes flexible bladders and breakaway valves, all meant to lessen the odds of a post-crash fire.
I don't know if anyone the helicopter just crashed. There's a fire going.
A fire like the one that killed flight nurse Leslie Stewart last year in Wichita Falls, Texas. That helicopter lacked a crash-worthy system.
It's disgusting how the FAA has, for 20 years, turned a blind eye to the kind of change that they need to make.
In Colorado, we found 9 of the 17 air ambulance operations use helicopters not required to have crash-resistant fuel systems. 173 of the 288 helicopters registered in the state also fall into that category, according to our database.
We should care because good people are getting hurt in accidents where they should not be hurt.
After 9 Wants to Know briefed Colorado Congressman Ed Perlmutter on the problem, he demanded the FAA act with expediency to address the country's problem with antiquated, dangerous fuel systems.
I don't know what's taken so long. Get on with this. On a going forward basis, all the newly manufactured helicopters should have this crash-resistant fuel system.
That could take a while. When we asked the head of the NTSB,
The military figured this out in the 70s. It's now 2015. What's it going to take?
when we asked him what the FAA should do, he said this.
But I'd have to defer to them, ask you to ask them that question.
And so, after repeated requests for an interview, we finally did. And all the FAA would tell us was this.
We're constantly looking at, do we need to adjust whatever actions we're taking and the appropriate standard.
The appropriate standard. That from an agency that's had 40 years to study the problem. In October, the FAA announced it will consider requiring crash-worthy systems on all newly manufactured helicopters, but gave itself until next year to start another round of studies.
This has to change. It has to stop. We can't have our crew members burning to death in what would have otherwise likely have been survivable helicopter crashes.
Krista Haugen is a nurse and co-founder of the Air Medical Survivors Network. She knows without immediate action, more fires like the one seen in Frisco are all but guaranteed.
More helicopters, unfortunately, are probably going to crash. And if they don't have a crash-worthy fuel system, we could very likely see this very type of accident happen again.
It's not like we have to invent the wheel. The wheel has already been invented. It's just a matter of implementing it into the aircraft.
Former NTSB investigator Greg Feith knows in many cases a design already exists. We found this, a supplemental type certificate for a crash-worthy fuel system for the AS350, the model that crashed in Frisco. The FAA approved the design in 1992.
I believe they did some significant development work toward a more crash-worthy fuel system that unfortunately they have, for whatever reason, not incorporated into the helicopters that they've made since that time.
And that's important because we found the AS350 stood out when we looked at hundreds of accident reports.
Take, for example, the Bell 407. It's a helicopter that is required to have a crash-resistant fuel system on board. When it was involved in a fatal crash during that time period, it experienced a fire 19% of the time. The AS350, the type of helicopter that crashed in Frisco, experienced a fire during that same time period of 48%. It is the highest rate of the 4 popular helicopters we examined.
911, flight for life helicopter just crashed.
After our initial reports aired,
Air Methods, one of the country's largest helicopter operators, sent us a statement. This statement, which is sending a message to owners and operators around the country, is that Air Methods intends to retrofit its entire fleet of AS350s with crash-worthy fuel systems starting next year. With more than 100 in the fleet, it is an unprecedented move. And Airbus, the current manufacturer of the AS350, says from now on, every one of those helicopters that comes off the line will include, as standard, a crash-worthy fuel system. Every one from now on.
Engine 2, Ambulance 8, respond to the helicopter at Summit Medical Center.
Those asking what's fueling the fire
engulfed.
need look no further than this tape. Why some say it should change everything.
It's an honor to be here.
Days after the fiery crash in Frisco,
Flag up. Good job, Scout.
while others were thinking of the pilot who died,
Dave, as we speak, is fighting for his life.
the pilot's son was thinking of one of the flight nurses who survived.
I whispered in his ear that Dad loved him.
The flight nurse who was barely alive.
And to keep fighting.
That was 5 months ago. 5 months and 30 plus surgeries later, that flight nurse, Dave Repsher, is still fighting inside an Aurora hospital burn unit.
If things would have changed 20 years ago, that fire probably doesn't happen.
I think that's a safe assumption.
We asked Stephen Sweeney,
There's the fire. There's the fuel.
director of the Air Medical Memorial, to watch parts of the video 9 Wants to Know obtained of the crash. Video that prompted the helicopter's operator to send us a cease and desist letter that stated airing it would lack newsworthy purpose.
At this point, everybody's out.
Afterward, Sweeney told us
Very tough to watch.
Someone over at the FAA darn well ought to consider it newsworthy.
When you read accounts, when you know what happened, it doesn't put it together in the same way that it does to actually see real-time video. You realize how very little time there is to get out of an aircraft that's on fire.
5 seconds, fire. 12 seconds, fuel leak. 20 seconds, inferno. You'll spend more time brushing your teeth tonight.
You can't watch that video and not be compelled to make some changes.
Survivors Network co-founder Krista Haugen says the video, while brutal to watch, shows the problem to horrific perfection.
Some people cannot be convinced of the need for these changes until they see with their own eyes something like that video portrays.
The NTSB still can't say why the helicopter went down. Why it burst into flames is another matter. Yet the FAA has ultimate control here.
Do you believe the FAA acts too slowly?
Well, we would think all regulators could act more quickly, and that's why we push it.
I tell them they need to go and look at the accidents that I see on a daily basis and put themselves in the shoes of the person that was in that helicopter, and then tell me that it costs too much.
30 to 60 grand on a $3 million helicopter. Not cheap, but consider the alternative, say victims.
It won't define who I am, but it'll be with me the rest of my life.
Victims with scars as deep as the solution is evident.
It would make so much sense to fix a problem that can be fixed.
Helicopter down.
A problem solved decades ago.
Helicopter fully involved.
A problem that erupted once again in July.
We're advising fire.
And a problem just waiting for someone to say, enough.
If nothing happens fast, more people are going to die.
Absolutely. And more people are going to be severely burned.